The bulletproof glass of the Oval Office didn't shatter. It spiderwebbed, a heavy, dull thud vibrating through the soles of my polished Oxfords as the first body slammed against it. It wasn't a bullet. It was a man, or what used to be a man, wearing a navy blue janitor's uniform with Gary stitched on the pocket. His face was a raw, wet mess of exposed muscle, his jaw hanging by a single tendon as he beat his skull against the reinforced glazing. The sound, a wet, rhythmic slap crack, is something I'll never forget. Beside me, the President of the United States stood frozen, a gold-plated pen still hovering over an executive order. The smell of high-end floor wax and expensive mahogany was suddenly choked out by the sharp, metallic tang of blood and something else, something like spoiled meat left out in the D.C. humidity. "Get him to the Pias!" I screamed, the professional veneer of the Secret Service shattering instantly. My hand was already on my SIG, Sour P229, the grip slick, with a sudden cold sweat. We didn't know what it was yet. We thought it was a chemical attack, maybe a coordinated suicide squad. But Gary the janitor didn't have a bomb. He had teeth. And as the door to the West Wing burst inward, the screams that followed weren't human. They were high-pitched, rattling screeches that sounded like a blender full of glass. My partner, Miller, tried to intercept the first one, a female intern who moved with a jerky, unnatural speed. She didn't reach for a weapon. She lunged for his throat. I saw the blood spray across the white-painted trim of the hallway, a vibrant, terrifying crimson against the pristine decor of the most powerful building on Earth. We were moving a tactical diamond around the package, our feet pounding on the thick carpets. Every light in the hallway began to flicker as the power grid started to fail, casting long, rhythmic shadows that seemed to jump at us from every alcove. I remember thinking about my wife, Sarah, back at our place in Arlington. She'd be making coffee right now, letting the golden retriever out into the backyard with its white picket fence. The American dream felt like a fragile porcelain doll being crushed under a combat boot. We hit the stairwell, the air thick with the smell of ozone and gunpowder. Miller was down. I didn't look back. You can't look back when you're carrying the weight of the free world on your shoulders. The stairs were a bottleneck of carnage. A group of staffers were huddled near the landing, but they weren't hiding. They were feeding. The sound of teeth grinding against bone filled the narrow concrete space, echoing like a nightmare in a cathedral. I fired. 3 rounds, center mass. The things didn't even flinch. It wasn't until a 4th round took the top of a staffer's head off that they stayed down. "Headshots only!" I yelled to the remaining detail. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. We reached the heavy steel door of the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, the bunker. The code wouldn't work. The system was dead. We were trapped in the sub-basement with the lights dying and the sound of hundreds of shuffling feet coming down the stairs behind us. I looked at the president. He looked like an old man, just a tired, terrified old man. This wasn't supposed to happen here. Not in the heart of the Capitol. Not in the fortress. I jammed my shoulder against a maintenance door, a narrow service tunnel that led toward the Treasury building. It was our only shot. We crawled through the dark, the sound of the horde scratching at the steel door behind us, growing louder. 1,000 fingernails on metal. The air was cold and damp, smelling of old pipes and wet earth. My tactical flashlight cut a narrow path through the gloom, reflecting off the rats, that scurried away from the commotion. We emerged in a basement storage room, the shelves lined with dusty boxes of records. Outside, the sirens were a constant morning wail. I peeked through a high, barred window. Washington, D.C. was burning. The black smoke from a dozen fires rose into the overcast sky, blotting out the sun. Black Hawk helicopters circled like vultures, their searchlights sweeping the streets where the motorcade sat abandoned. Doors flung wide, blood smeared across the black armor. I realized then that there was no cavalry coming. The chain of command was a broken link. It was just me, a gun with 2 mags left, and a man who was supposed to be the leader of the world, huddled in the dark among tax records. We had to move. We had to get to the helipad at the State Department, or we were just waiting to be dinner. Every shadow in that basement felt like a lunging threat. I could hear them in the vents, a clicking, scratching sound that followed our movement. My internal monologue was a frantic loop of tactical assessments and pure, unadulterated dread. If the White House fell in 20 minutes, what chance did the rest of the world have? We reached the street level through a delivery entrance. The heat hit us first, the literal wall of heat from a burning bus nearby. The smell was the worst part. It was the smell of a city dying. Trash cans overturned, the morning editions of the Post blowing across the asphalt, soaked in gore. I saw a stroller overturned near the curb. I didn't look inside. I couldn't. We stayed low, moving from shadow to shadow, using the charred husks of SUVs for cover. A pack of them, maybe 30, were milling around the fountain at Lafayette Square. They weren't the slow, shuffling things from the movies. They were twitchy, their heads snapping toward any sound with predatory precision. I held my breath as we bypassed them, the president's hand gripping the back of my suit jacket so hard I thought the fabric would tear. We were 2 blocks from the extraction point. When the sky opened up, rain started to fall, heavy and cold, washing the blood into the gutters. It should have been a relief, but it just made the ground slick and dampened the sounds of their approach. I heard the wet slap of feet on pavement behind us. I didn't turn. I just ran, dragging the most powerful man in the world into the mouth of a literal hell, praying that my training was enough to survive the night. We scrambled over a collapsed security fence, the jagged metal tearing into my palms. I didn't feel the pain. Adrenaline is a hell of a drug. It narrows the world down to a single point of focus. The next 10 feet. We reached an alleyway behind a popular D.C. steakhouse. The smell of expensive grilled meat was still there, masked by the stench of the dumpster and the copper tang of a fresh kill nearby. A figure stepped out from behind a stack of crates. It was a police officer, his uniform torn, his badge gleaming dully in the rain. For a second, I felt a surge of hope. Then, I saw his eyes. They weren't eyes anymore. They were milky orbs of white marble, fixed on my throat. He didn't shout a warning. He just hissed, a sound like steam escaping a pipe, and charged. I brought the cig up, but the rain made the slide slippery. One shot went wide, shattering a brick near his head. The second caught him in the chest, knocking him back, but not stopping him. He was on me before I could fire a third. The weight of him was immense, cold and solid. I smelled the stale coffee on his breath as his teeth snapped inches from my nose. I jammed my forearm under his chin, my other hand reaching for my tactical knife. The blade slid into the base of his skull with a sickening crunch. He went limp, his weight pinning me to the wet pavement. I pushed him off, gasping for air, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would crack a rib. The president was shaking, his eyes wide, staring at the corpse. "We don't have time to mourn," I hissed, grabbing him by the lapels and pulling him up. We moved through the back of the restaurant, the kitchen a scene of absolute chaos. Copper pots lay scattered on the floor, the industrial ovens still humming. A half-finished plate of eggs sat on the counter, a silent testament to how fast the world ended. We found a service exit that led to a narrow street behind the State Department. The helipad was on the roof, but the elevators were out, 30 floors of stairs. In my head, I started counting rounds. I had 12 in the chamber and 1 spare mag, 13 chances to live. I looked at the president, his face pale under the flickering fluorescent lights of the service lobby. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of the man he used to be. "Do what you have to do, Agent," he whispered. I nodded, checked the corner, and began the climb. Every floor was a gamble. On the 14th, we heard them banging on the fire door, the metal groaning under the pressure of a dozen bodies. On the 22nd, the smell of smoke became unbearable. The lower floors were on fire. My lungs burned. My legs felt like lead, but the primal urge to survive pushed me forward. We reached the roof access, the wind howling through the door. The rain was a deluge now, blurring the skyline of the burning city. I could see the lights of a lone MH-60 Jayhawk circling, its searchlight cutting through the gray mist. I pulled a flare from my vest, my hands shaking as I struck it. The brilliant red light hissed into the night, a defiant scream against the darkness. The helicopter turned, the beat of its rotors a beautiful rhythmic thud. It started its descent, the downdraft nearly blowing us off the ledge. But as the bird hovered inches from the deck, the side door slid open. It wasn't a rescue team inside. It was empty, the interior coated in fresh, wet streaks of red, and the pilot's head was slumped against the glass, his hand still twitching on the controls. We weren't being saved. We were just finding a new place to die. The rotor wash hit us like a physical wall, a screaming vortex of freezing rain and kerosene fumes that threatened to toss us like rag dolls over the edge of the parapet. I saw the pilot, or what was left of him, his face pressed against the plexiglass, a mask of shredded skin and milky eyes. He wasn't flying. The bird was hovering on some programmed autopilot, or by the sheer terrifying grace of a jammed cyclic. I didn't think. I couldn't afford to. I grabbed Miller, the young communications aide who had somehow survived the crawl through the east wing, and shoved him toward the open sliding door. He slipped on the blood-slicked floorboards, his scream lost in the roar of the GET 700 engines. I followed, diving into the bay, my boots skidding on something wet and visceral. The interior was a slaughterhouse. Stretcher straps swung wildly, tipped with bits of bone, and the floor was an inch deep in a slurry of cold rain and warm gore. I didn't have time to mourn the previous occupants. The bird lurched violently to the left. The pilot's head snapped back, his jaw unhinged, snapping at the empty air as his harness strained. I drew my P229, the metal cold and slippery in my shaking hand. I didn't hesitate. One round through the back of the flight helmet. The glass spiderwebbed, sprayed with a fresh coat of gray and crimson, and the pilot went limp, his weight sagging onto the controls. The helicopter began a sickening, nose-down roll toward the south lawn. I scrambled into the cockpit, my fingers fumbling with the harness release of the dead man. I had to haul his cooling carcass out of the seat, while the ground rushed up to meet us. The White House fountain, now a stagnant pool of black water and floating limbs, was growing larger by the second. I kicked the body into the footwell and grabbed the stick, My training was in VIP protection, not aviation, but every Secret Service agent gets a crash course in emergency egress across various platforms. I pulled back on the collective, feeling the strain in the airframe as the rotors bit into the humid air. The Jayhawk groaned, a metallic scream of protest, and we leveled out barely 20 feet above the heads of the thousands of shufflers swarming the north portico. From this height, they looked like a carpet of gray moths drawn to the flame of the burning mansion. I banked hard, my stomach lurching, and headed toward the Potomac. Miller was hyperventilating in the back, huddled against a stack of empty ammo crates. He was staring at his hands, which were coated in the pilot's blood. "They're everywhere," he whispered, though I could only see his lips moving over the headset. "Chief, they're everywhere. There's no green zone. There's no away left." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My eyes were fixed on the horizon. Washington, D.C., the seat of power, the shining city on a hill, was a funeral pyre. The Washington Monument stood like a jagged tombstone over a landscape of gridlocked highways and blooming fireballs. The bridges were choked with abandoned cars, thousands of them, creating steel dams that people were trying to scramble over. I could see the muzzle flashes from the rooftops of the apartment complexes in Foggy Bottom, isolated pockets of survivors burning through their last magazines before the inevitable. The radio was a chaotic soup of static and broken distress calls. "This is Arlington. We are being overrun. Request immediate extraction. Sierra 19er, do not land at the Pentagon. Repeat, the Pentagon is black." The reality of it settled in my chest like a lead weight. The chain of command hadn't just been broken. It had been pulverized. I looked at the digital fuel readout. We had maybe 40 minutes of flight time left. The Jayhawk had been running on fumes when it found us. A ghost ship looking for a harbor that didn't exist anymore. I pushed the nose toward the west, away from the city. I needed to find somewhere, anywhere, that wasn't a death trap of high-density population. We flew over the Virginia suburbs, and it was the same story. Subdivisions that used to be the height of American comfort were now labyrinths of fire and shadow. I saw a school bus overturned in the middle of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by a ring of figures that moved with a sickening, twitching synchronicity. The psychological toll began to gnaw at me then. The realization that the badge on my chest, the oath I'd taken to protect the Constitution, meant nothing if there was no one left to govern. I was just a man in a ruined suit with a stolen helicopter and a passenger who was slowly losing his mind. The rain continued to lash the windshield, the wipers struggling to clear the grime. Then the master caution light began to flicker. A low, rhythmic thumping started in the tail rotor. We had taken fire, or maybe the pilot had clipped something before he turned. Either way, the bird was dying. "Get ready!" I shouted over the comms, though I didn't know for what. I saw a stretch of dark woodland near the edge of the Shenandoah, a small clearing near an abandoned ranger station. It was the best I could do. The controls felt like they were encased in concrete. I wrestled with the collective, trying to bleed off airspeed without falling out of the sky. The tail rotor gave out with a spectacular metal-on-metal shriek, and the Jayhawk began to spin. The world became a blur of gray sky and green forest. Miller screamed, a high, thin sound that was cut short as we clipped the tops of the oaks. The sound of the crash was deafening. The rending of aluminum, the shattering of the rotors against ancient wood, and then the final, bone-jarring impact. Silence followed, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the steady patter of rain on the mangled fuselage. I was hanging upside down in my harness, the smell of hydraulic fluid and pine needles filling my nostrils. My vision was swimming in red. I reached up, my fingers numb, and fumbled for the release. I fell hard against the ceiling, my shoulder screaming in protest. Miller was a lump of shadows in the back, groaning. He was alive, but barely. I dragged myself out of the cockpit, my legs feeling like they were made of glass. The helicopter had carved a scar through the forest, a path of broken branches and twisted metal. It was dark, the kind of absolute darkness you only find far from the city lights. But the forest wasn't quiet. Far off, back toward the direction of the suburbs, I heard it, the collective moan of 1,000 hungry throats. Alerted by the crash, I crawled to Miller and pulled him from the wreckage. He had a deep gash across his forehead, and his left arm was hanging at an unnatural angle. I didn't have a medkit. I had my sidearm, 3 spare magazines, a tactical knife, and a flare gun. With no more flares, resource scarcity wasn't a theory anymore. It was the boundary of our existence. We dragged ourselves into the shadow of the ranger station, a small stone building that looked like it had been built during the Depression. The door was locked. I didn't have the strength to kick it, so I used the butt of my cig to shatter the window. I pushed Miller through and tumbled in after him, the glass cutting into my palms. Inside, it smelled of dry rot and old paper. I found a heavy wooden desk and shoved it against the door, my muscles burning with a white-hot intensity. Miller was slumped against the wall, his breathing ragged. I sat down beside him, the cold from the stone floor seeping into my bones. For the first time in 10 hours, I looked at my watch. It was 3:14 a.m. The sun wouldn't be up for hours, and we were trapped in a wooden box in the middle of a forest that was quickly filling with the dead. I checked my magazines. 28 rounds. 28 rounds to hold off the end of the world. I thought about the president. I'd seen him go down in the bunker, a swarm of his own loyal staff tearing into him before I could even clear leather. The irony wasn't lost on me. The most protected man on Earth, undone by a virus that didn't care about security clearances or nuclear footballs. I reached into my inner pocket and pulled out a crumpled photo of my wife and daughter. They were in Chicago. If D.C. looked like that, Chicago was already gone. I felt a hollow cavern opening up in my chest, a void where hope used to live. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a crushing, soul-deep exhaustion. Every survival instinct told me to keep moving, to find a better position, to scavenge for food, but my body refused to obey. I was a Secret Service agent. I was trained to endure, to suffer, to survive. But as I heard the first dry scraping sound of fingernails against the exterior stone of the cabin, I realized that survival wasn't a victory. It was just a longer, more agonizing way to lose. The scratching grew louder. Then came the thud of a body hitting the door. Then another. They didn't growl like animals. They made this huffing, wet sound, the sound of lungs filled with fluid trying to pull in air. I looked at Miller. He was looking at me, his eyes wide and glassy. He knew. "Sir," he whispered, his voice cracking. Do you think anyone else made it?" I looked at the dark ceiling, the rain drumming a rhythmic funeral march above us. I thought about the empty helicopter, the burning city, the silence on the radio. "No," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. "I think we're the last ones." I stood up, testing my weight on my injured leg. I pulled my knife and wedged it into the gap of the window frame, creating a makeshift spear with a sturdy branch I'd found on the floor. I didn't have enough ammo to fight a war, but I had enough to make them earn every inch of us. The scratching was joined by a low, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. There were dozens of them now, maybe more, drawn to the scent of fresh blood and the heat of 2 living hearts. I checked the safety on my P229, 1 in the chamber, 2 in the mag for me and Miller if it came to that, 25 for the things outside. The psychological weight of the badge felt heavier than ever. It wasn't a symbol of authority anymore. It was a target. It represented a world that had failed, a system that had collapsed under the weight of its own fragility. I stripped the silver star from my lapel and threw it into the corner. It landed with a dull clink in the dust. I wasn't an agent anymore. I wasn't a protector. I was a scavenger, a ghost in a dead land. Miller started to cough, a wet, hacking sound that made the things outside go silent for a split second before their frenzy redoubled. The wood of the door began to groan under the pressure of a dozen bodies pushing against it. I could see the hinges straining, the screws slowly backing out of the rotted frame. I looked around the small room. There was an old iron stove in the corner, a stack of yellowed maps, and a rack of rusted tools. I grabbed a heavy fire axe from the wall, the weight of it familiar and grounding. If I was going to die in this hole, I was going to do it on my feet, swinging until the world went black. I moved Miller further into the corner and stood in the center of the room. The axe held low. The first hand broke through the window, a pale, bloated thing with jagged fingernails that tore at the air. I didn't feel fear anymore. I felt a strange, cold clarity. The world had ended, and the rules were simple now. Breathe as long as you can, and kill anything that tries to stop you. The doorframe gave way with a splintering crack. The first of them tumbled in, a woman in a torn nightgown, her throat a cavernous red ruin. Behind her, a wall of gray flesh and gnashing teeth pressed forward. I raised the axe, the muscles in my arms screaming as I brought it down. The impact was sickeningly solid, the blade burying itself in the crown of her skull. I kicked her back into the mass, using the momentum to pull the axe free. The room was suddenly filled with the stench of decay and the sounds of a nightmare. I swung again and again. My world shrank to the size of that small stone room, a frantic dance of steel and bone. Miller was screaming now, a sound that joined the chorus of the damned. I felt a hand catch my ankle, pulling me down. I fired my sidearm into the face of the thing at my feet, the muzzle flash illuminating the room in jagged bursts of white light. Blood, dark, cold, and foul, sprayed my face. I couldn't tell what was mine and what was theirs. I was losing ground. They were coming through the window, through the door, pouring in like a tide of filth. I backed up against the desk, my lungs burning, my vision tunneling. This was it, the new place to die the helicopter had promised us. I looked at Miller, who was being pulled toward the window, his fingers clawing at the floorboards. I raised the cig, my finger tightening on the trigger to give him the mercy he deserved, but the slide locked back, empty. I had burned through the magazines without even realizing it. I dropped the gun and gripped the axe with both hands, a roar tearing from my own throat that sounded as primal and broken as the things I was fighting. I swung at the nearest one, a man in a tattered business suit. his eyes reflecting the pale moonlight. I felt the blade sink into his shoulder, but he didn't flinch. He just kept coming, his hands reaching for my throat. I was being submerged. The weight of them was crushing the air from my chest. And then, through the chaos, I heard it. A sound that shouldn't have been there. A high-pitched, mechanical whine, followed by a blinding flash of white light from the clearing outside. A heavy-caliber machine gun began to bark. The rhythmic thud, thud, thud of a .50 cal tearing through the thin wooden walls of the cabin. The things around me were being shredded, turned into clouds of red mist and bone fragments. I hit the floor, covering my head as the wall behind me disintegrated under the hail of lead. The moaning outside turned into wet thuds as the things were mowed down like wheat. A voice boomed over a loudspeaker, distorted and metallic. "Clear the structure. All non-hostiles stay on the deck. This is a scorched earth sweep." I looked up through the holes in the wall. A massive, blacked-out armored transport, an MRAP, was idling in the clearing, its roof-mounted turret spitting fire into the woods. Figures in full NBC suits and tactical gear were bailing out of the back, moving with a lethal mechanical precision that made the Secret Service look like amateurs. They weren't rescue. They weren't the National Guard. Their gear bore a logo I'd only seen in the most classified briefings. A private containment initiative, funded by the very conglomerates that had likely started this mess. They weren't here to save us. They were here to clean the slate. I watched as one of the soldiers approached the window, his suppressed rifle raised. He looked at me through a darkened visor, his movements cold and devoid of humanity. He didn't ask if I was bitten. He didn't ask for my name. He just raised the weapon to his shoulder, the red dot of his laser sight dancing across my chest. I looked at the axe in my hand, then at the dying boy in the corner, and finally at the badge lying in the dust. I realized then that I'd been wrong. We weren't the last ones. We were just the last ones who remembered what it was like to be human. And in this new world, that was the most dangerous thing you could be. I closed my eyes as the soldier's finger tightened on the trigger, the rain still falling, cold and indifferent, on the ruins of the world I had failed to protect. The trigger didn't click. It hissed, a sound like a viper in the tall grass, as the suppressed round exited the barrel, but the bullet didn't find my heart. In the microsecond of the soldier's contraction, the ceiling above us groaned with the weight of 1,000 pounds of sodden plaster and the writhing, mindless meat that had been clawing at the roof for hours. The structure gave way in a thundering cascade of debris and gray dust, a literal avalanche of the undead pouring through the breach like a morbid waterfall. The soldier was buried instantly, his laser sight spinning wildly across the room, painting frantic red streaks through the dust before being extinguished under a pile of snapping jaws and thrashing limbs. I didn't wait to see if he'd survive the crush. I lunged for Danny, my fingers digging into the rough fabric of his jacket, and hauled his feather-light frame behind the heavy mahogany desk of the Chief of Staff. The room was a cacophony of wet tearing sounds and the muffled rhythmic thuds of the soldier's rifle discharging into the mass of bodies, pinning him down. I looked at the axe in my hand, the steel slick with a cocktail of old and new blood, and I felt a cold, crystalline clarity settle over me. The oath I'd taken to the Constitution was dead, buried under the rubble of a fallen capital, but the oath I'd taken to the boy, the unspoken promise of a man who had failed everyone else, that was the only thing keeping the darkness from swallowing me whole. Danny's eyes were glassy, his breathing a shallow, itching rattle that tore at my chest. I pressed a hand over his mouth to keep his whimpers from drawing the things in the center of the room. We watched through the gap in the desk as the cleaners outside the window realized their comrade was lost. They didn't move to help him. Instead, they tossed a thermobaric canister through the shattered pane. The world turned white. The roar was deafening, a wall of heat that singed the hair on my arms and sucked the oxygen out of the room in a hungry gasp. The pressure slammed my head against the floor, and for a long, agonizing minute, there was only the high-pitched ringing of a world that had ended. When I opened my eyes, the room was a charred skeleton. The pile of zombies was a blackened, smoldering mound, and the soldier was nothing but a scorched silhouette against the ruined carpet. The rain coming through the hole in the ceiling hissed as it hit the hot embers. I dragged myself up, my limbs heavy as lead, and checked Danny. He was unconscious, his skin a terrifying shade of parchment, but his heart was still stubborn. I slung him over my shoulder, the weight of him a constant reminder of my failure, and stepped over the carbonized remains of the men who had come to erase us. I needed to get out of the West Wing. I needed to get to the tunnels, the deep ones, that even the conglomerates didn't have on their digitized maps. But as I reached the door to the hallway, a voice crackled through the comms unit on the dead soldier's vest. It wasn't a tactical command. It was a voice I recognized, a voice that had stood beside me during the inauguration, a voice that had shared coffee with me in the small hours of the graveyard shift. It was Miller, my partner, my friend. He was telling the extraction team to move to the South Lawn, that the biological assets had been neutralized, and the witnesses were being purged according to the Crestline protocol. The betrayal hit harder than the blast. Miller had been the one to tell me to take the boy. He'd been the one who pointed me toward this wing. He hadn't been trying to save us. He'd been herding us into a kill zone. I moved through the smoke-choked corridors like a ghost, the axe held low. Every shadow was a threat, every groan of the building's settling bones, a heart-stopping terror. The White House, once a symbol of unyielding power, was now a labyrinth of rot. I passed the entrance to the press briefing room, the door hanging off its hinges. Inside, the podium where the truth had been twisted for decades was now draped with the entrails of a staffer who hadn't been fast enough. The smell was in physical weight, a mixture of cordite, copper, and the sweet cloying stench of the ghouls that were wandering the halls in aimless, predatory hunger. I reached the stairwell leading to the basement, but the door was welded shut from the other side. They were sealing the building. They weren't just cleaning. They were entombing everyone inside to ensure the containment initiative stayed a secret. My breath came in ragged bursts as I realized we were being buried alive in the most famous tomb on Earth. I turned, looking for another way, when the heavy thud of tactical boots echoed from the floor above. They were coming down. The professional killers in their high-tech suits, equipped with thermal optics that would see the heat of my desperation through the walls. I ducked into a closet, the cramped space smelling of floor wax and old mops. I held Danny close, feeling the heat of his fever burning through my shirt. I could hear them speaking in the hall, low, clipped sentences of men doing the job. Sector 4 clear. No signs of the agent or the specimen. Specimen. That's what they called the boy. I looked at Danny's face in the dim light filtering through the door slats. He wasn't a specimen. He was a kid who liked comic books and probably hated broccoli. He was the last scrap of innocence in a world that had gone rabid. I gripped the axe handle until my knuckles turned white. If I died here, I'd die on a pile of their brass casings. I waited until the footsteps faded, then slipped out, moving toward the kitchen. The service elevators were dead. but the dumbwaiter shafts were small, hidden, and led directly to the sub-basement levels near the old bunker. It was a tight fit, and I had to strap Danny to my chest with my belt to keep him from slipping. The descent was a nightmare of rusted metal and jagged edges, my fingernails tearing as I lowered us inch by inch into the bowels of the house. When I hit the bottom, the air was colder, damp with the moisture of the Potomac, seeping through the aging foundations. This was the underbelly, the forgotten veins of the city. But I wasn't alone. In the flickering light of a dying emergency bulb, I saw them, not the ghouls, not the soldiers. These were the ones who had been forgotten long before the world ended. The staff, the maintenance workers, the people who actually made the White House run. They were huddled in the shadows, their eyes wide with a feral, terminal fear. And in the center of them, holding a Sig Sauer with the practiced ease of a man who had lost everything, was Miller. He looked older than he had 3 hours ago. His tactical vest was stained with blood, and his visor was cracked, revealing eyes that were hollowed out by what he'd done. He didn't raise the gun immediately. He just looked at me, then at the dying boy strapped to my chest. "You should have stayed in the West Wing, Elias," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper that echoed off the damp concrete. "It would have been quick. The thermobarics, they don't leave enough of you to feel the change." I didn't say a word. I just shifted my weight, the axe heavy in my hand. The people behind him whimpered, shrinking further into the darkness. "Why, Miller?" I finally asked. "The oath, the service. Does any of that mean a damn thing to you?" He laughed, a dry hacking sound that ended in a cough. "The service is gone. There's only the legacy now. Crestline has the labs in the mountains. They have the seed banks. They have the cure, Elias, but they only have enough for the people who can rebuild. And the price of admission was a clean slate here. No witnesses to how the plague started. No one to tell the world that the government didn't lose control. They gave it away." He raised the Sig, the front side post aligning with my head. "Give me the boy. He's the carrier. His blood is the only reason I'm still talking to you. He's the key to the refined serum. Give him to me, and I'll make sure you get a seat on the last transport." I looked at the people behind him, the cooks, the janitors, the interns. They were the ones Miller was going to leave behind, to be devoured or burned. They were the unnecessary parts of the world. I looked at Danny, whose eyes had opened just a crack, staring at Miller with a terrifying, silent understanding. "You're not saving the world, Miller," I said, my voice dropping to a low growl. "You're just making sure the same monsters stay in charge of the ruins." The movement was a blur. Miller fired, the muzzle flash illuminating the basement in a strobe light horror. I dived to the left, the bullet whistling past my ear and shattering a ceramic pipe behind me. Steam erupted into the air, a white curtain of heat and noise. I didn't run away. I ran at him. I was a Secret Service agent, trained in every form of violence the state could teach, but in that moment, I was just a man with an axe and a reason to hate. Miller tried to track me through the steam, but I was a shadow. I came low, the axe swinging in a wide, brutal arc. The blade caught him in the thigh, biting deep through the tactical gear and into the bone. He screamed, a raw, primal sound, and collapsed to one knee. I didn't stop. I brought the blunt end of the axe down on his wrist, hearing the satisfying crunch of his bones as the gun clattered away into the dark. I stood over him, the steam swirling around us like ghosts. "Finish it," Miller gasped, clutching his shattered leg, his face pale with shock. The extraction team is 5 minutes out. If you don't kill me, they'll kill all of us. At least if I'm dead, I don't have to see what they do to you. I looked at him, my former friend, and I felt a coldness that surpassed the winter rain outside. I didn't kill him. I couldn't. Not because of the old oath, but because if I did, I'd be just like him. I'd be another person deciding who lived and who died for the sake of a clean slate. Instead, I turned to the huddled group in the shadows. The tunnels to the Treasury building are still open. I told them, my voice loud and commanding. Go, now. Take the maintenance stairs. Don't stop for anything. They didn't need to be told twice. They surged forward, a desperate tide of humanity, disappearing into the dark of the lower vents. I turned back to Miller, who was watching me with a mixture of pity and awe. I reached down and took his radio, then his sidearm. You're wrong about the boy, Miller, I said, unstrapping Danny and cradling him in my arms. He's not a carrier. He's just a kid. And that's the only legacy worth saving. I left him there, bleeding on the cold floor of the house we had failed to protect. I carried Danny through the maintenance tunnels, the air getting thinner, the sound of the storm above replaced by the heavy rhythmic thud of the corporate helicopters landing on the lawn. They were here to harvest. They were here to burn. I found the emergency hatch that led to the old sewer lines, the ones the British had used to try and burn the city in 1814. History was repeating itself. The city was being razed, not by a foreign enemy, but by the greed that had always lived in its heart. The sewers were a nightmare of waist-deep filth and the echoes of the things that had migrated underground. I moved with a singular focus, my muscles screaming, my vision blurring. Every time I felt like dropping, I felt Danny's small hand clutch at my shirt, a weak, desperate grip that acted like a jolt of electricity to my heart. We traveled for hours, lost in the bowels of a dead city, until the air finally began to smell like something other than rot. We emerged through a manhole in the middle of a residential street in Virginia, miles from the White House. The sun was beginning to bleed through the gray clouds, a pale, sickly light that showed the true extent of the devastation. The suburbs were a graveyard, rows of houses with X marks on the doors, the silence so heavy it felt like it had weight. I found a car, an old SUV with the keys still in the ignition and a body in the driver's seat that I had to unceremoniously drag out. I laid Danny across the back seat and covered him with a tattered blanket I found in the trunk. I sat in the driver's seat, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. My badge was gone. My gun was someone else's. My country was a memory. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror, a man covered in the blood of his friends and the filth of the earth, his eyes reflecting a world that had moved past the need for agents and presidents. I started the engine, the rumble feeling like a roar in the tomb-quiet street. I didn't know where we were going. I didn't know if there was anywhere left that wasn't owned by a conglomerate or overrun by the dead. But as I pulled away from the curb, Danny let out a small, shaky breath and whispered a single word. Thank you. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just drove, leaving the smoke of Washington behind us, a pillar of black soot rising into the morning sky. I had survived the fall of the White House, but the war for what it meant to be human was just beginning. And as the road stretched out before us, littered with the wreckage of a civilization that had forgotten its soul, I knew that the badge didn't matter anymore. The oath didn't matter. Only the boy mattered. Only the living. I gripped the wheel tighter, the axe resting on the passenger seat like a grim relic of a past life. The rain started again, but this time it felt like it was washing the world clean, not just hiding the blood. We were moving into the unknown, two ghosts in a dying world, looking for a place where the dead didn't walk and the living didn't kill for a seat at a table that no longer existed. I pushed the accelerator down, the engine's growl the only sound in the vast, empty morning, and we drove into the gray, waiting for the light to finally break. The road ahead wasn't a road anymore. It was a scar across a landscape that was rapidly forgetting the touch of man. We bypassed the major arteries, avoiding the tangled graveyards of steel and glass, where the interstate met the beltway. Those were dead zones, choked with the rusted remains of 1,000 panicked escapes that had gone nowhere. Instead, I kept us to the secondary routes, the winding veins of Virginia's backwoods, where the trees crowded the asphalt like silent sentinels watching the world end. Leo, the boy, hadn't spoken since we crossed the Potomac. He sat huddled in the oversized tactical jacket I draped over him, his eyes fixed on the blurring green of the forest. He wasn't crying. That was the most unsettling part. He had the 1,000-yard stare of a man 3 times his age, a child who had seen the halls of power turned into a slaughterhouse. I checked the rearview mirror every 30 seconds, a reflex honed by years of motorcade duty, but there was nothing behind us but the settling mist and the ghosts of a fallen capital. My hands were stained with things that wouldn't wash off, not even in the driving rain that lashed against the windshield. But I gripped the wheel until my knuckles were white. I had spent my entire career preparing to take a bullet for a principal, for a seat of power, for a man behind a mahogany desk. Now my entire world was contained within the cab of a stolen SUV, and my only mission was to make sure the boy's heart kept beating. As the hours bled into one another, the fuel gauge began its slow, inevitable descent toward empty. We were deep in the Appalachians now, where the air was thinner and smelled of pine and damp earth instead of smoke and copper. I pulled into a dilapidated service station, nestled in a valley that looked like it hadn't seen a customer since before the world broke. I didn't just hop out. The agent in me took over. I cut the engine and sat in the sudden, ringing silence. Listening, there was the rhythmic ticking of the cooling engine, the patter of rain on the roof, and the distant, lonely cry of a hawk. No groans, no shuffling footsteps. I reached over and grabbed the axe, the weight of it familiar and grounding. I told Leo to stay low, to stay quiet, and I stepped out into the mud. The air was cold, a biting reminder that winter was coming, and winter would be the real test. The dead didn't care about the cold, but the living did. I scouted the perimeter with a tactical precision that felt like a relic of a dead civilization. The windows of the station were smashed, the interior picked over by previous scavengers, but the underground tanks still held a few gallons of low-grade gasoline. I hand-cranked the pump, the mechanical whine echoing off the hills like a scream, and I felt a prickle of sweat on my neck despite the chill. I was exposed. Out here, I wasn't an elite agent with a radio and a backup team. I was just meat in a world of predators. We moved on as the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long, distorted shadows across our path. We found shelter in an old hunting lodge, a heavy timber structure that looked like it could withstand a siege. I spent the first hour boarding up the lower windows, using the last of the daylight to secure our perimeter. Leo finally spoke when I was stoking a fire in the hearth. He asked me if everyone was gone, not just his father, the president, but everyone. I looked at him, his face illuminated by the flickering orange light, and I couldn't lie. I told him that a lot of people were gone, but that as long as we were standing, the story wasn't over. It was a hollow platitude, the kind of thing politicians say to grieving families, but it was all I had. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the door with the axe across my knees, watching the moon climb the sky through a gap in the shutters. I thought about the White House, about the way the marble floors had slicked with blood, and how the highest security clearance in the world couldn't stop the hunger of the dead. I realized then that the secret in Secret Service had changed. It wasn't about classified documents or covert operations anymore. The secret was how to remain human when the very definition of humanity was being torn apart. Weeks turned into a month. We stopped being refugees and started becoming survivors. I taught Leo how to track, how to move through the woods without snapping a twig, how to sharpen a blade until it could shave the hair off his arm. We scavenged, we hunted, and we hid. The world was quiet now, a terrible, heavy silence that pressed down on you. But in that silence, I started to hear things I'd ignored for years. The sound of a stream, the rhythm of the wind, the steady breathing of the boy beside me. We weren't just fleeing anymore. We were looking for something, though I didn't know what it was until we saw the smoke. It wasn't the black, oily smoke of a burning city. It was thin and white, rising from a chimney in a hidden valley 3 days' hike from the lodge. I approached it with the caution of a man who had seen how quickly a sanctuary could become a trap. We watched from the ridgeline for an entire day. I saw people, real people, moving with purpose. They were planting winter crops, hauling water. Children were playing in a fenced-in yard. There were guards, yes, but they weren't wearing tactical gear. They were wearing flannel and denim, carrying hunting rifles with the easy familiarity of farmers. The confrontation came at the edge of their perimeter. 3 men stepped out of the brush, their rifles leveled but not twitchy. They saw me, a man with the haunted eyes of a soldier and an axe that had seen too much use. And they saw the boy. I didn't reach for my weapon. I held my hands open, palms out, the universal gesture of the disarmed. I told them we were just passing through, but the man in the center, an older guy with a beard the color of slate, looked at Leo and then back at me. He saw the way I positioned myself between him and the boy. He saw the faded badge clipped to my belt, a piece of tin that meant nothing and everything at the same time. He lowered his rifle and asked me who I was. I opened my mouth to give my name and rank, to recite my credentials, but the words died in my throat. None of that existed anymore. The United States was a memory. The president was a ghost, and the White House was a tomb. I looked at Leo, who was watching me with a quiet, desperate hope, and I realized my oath had finally been fulfilled. I had protected the only part of the old world that was worth saving, its future. I'm just a protector, I said, my voice raspy from weeks of disuse. And he's just a boy. We're looking for a place where the dead stay buried. The old man nodded slowly, a grim understanding passing between us. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the valley floor, toward the houses and the smoke and the life that was stubbornly refusing to go out. As we walked down the trail, the weight that had been sitting on my chest since the first alarm went off in the West Wing finally began to lift. I wasn't an agent anymore. I wasn't a ghost. I was a man walking his son, for that's what he had become in the fires of the fall, into a new world. The axe stayed at my side, a reminder of what it took to get here, but I knew that one day, hopefully soon, I would trade it for a hoe or a hammer. We reached the gates of the settlement, and for the first time in forever, I didn't look back at the trail behind us. I looked at the garden, at the people, and at the sun which was finally, truly breaking through the clouds. The war for what it meant to be human would continue, but for today, we had won. We weren't just surviving, we were home. The transition from the life of a sentinel to the life of a settler wasn't an easy one. My mind was still wired for the X, the kill zone, the high-value target. Every time a door slammed in the settlement, my hand went to a holster that was no longer there. But Leo adapted with the terrifying fluidity of youth. He bonded with the other children, his laughter short and hesitant at first, becoming a regular sound in the evenings. I spent my days working the perimeter fence, using my knowledge of security to fortify our new home. But I did it differently now. I wasn't building a cage. I was building a shield. The leader of the community, the man with the slate-gray beard named Silas, became a friend, or as close to one as a man like me could have. He never asked about the White House, and I never volunteered the details. Some things were better left to the ash. We talked instead about soil acidity, about the migration patterns of the deer, and about how to keep the cold from seeping through the floorboards. It was a humble existence, a far cry from the corridors of power, where I had once walked with the leaders of the free world, but there was a purity in it that I had never known. In D.C., everything was layers of deception and strategy. Here, you either worked or you didn't eat. You either stood together or you fell alone. Winter hit hard in November, a brutal, blinding white that covered the world in a shroud of ice. The shufflers became less of a threat as the cold froze their necrotic joints, turning them into macabre statues in the woods. We went out on clearing parties, finding the frozen dead and ending them before the spring thaw could bring them back to life. It was grim work, but it felt like a holy duty, a cleaning of the earth. During one of these excursions, we found an old radio tower on a nearby peak. Silas wanted to strip it for parts, but I found myself drawn to the transmitter. For one brief, insane moment, I thought about trying to signal out to see if there was anyone left in the chain of command. I reached for the dial, my fingers trembling, but then I stopped. What would I say? Who would I be calling? The government I served was a casualty of its own hubris, a giant that had been too big to see the rot at its feet. If there were survivors in bunkers under the mountains, let them stay there. They were the architects of the old world. This valley belonged to the survivors of the new one. I took a crowbar and smashed the transmitter, a final, definitive break from the past. Christmas came, not with lights or shopping malls, but with a communal meal of roasted venison and root vegetables. We sat around a great fire in the center of the settlement, and for the first time, I saw Leo truly smile. He was holding a wooden toy one of the older men had carved for him, and his eyes were bright with a light I thought had been extinguished in the basement of the White House. I realized then that I had been wrong about my survival. I hadn't survived because I was a better shot or because I was more tactical. I had survived because I had something to live for that was bigger than a flag or a constitution. I had survived to see that smile. I sat back in the shadows, my back against a sturdy oak, watching the embers of the fire drift up toward the cold, indifferent stars. I felt the axe leaning against my leg, but I didn't need to hold it. For the first time in my life, I wasn't on duty. I wasn't scanning for threats. I was just a man, tired and scarred, but alive. As the years passed, the memory of the White House began to feel like a dream, a strange and distant myth from another life. The suit and tie were gone, replaced by heavy wool and stained leather. My hands were calloused and mapped with the scars of honest labor. Leo grew tall and strong, a leader in his own right, born of the old world, but forged in the new. He didn't remember the name of the vice president or the layout of the West Wing, but he knew how to lead men through a storm and how to show mercy to the broken. We eventually built a small house on the edge of the valley, a place where the view of the mountains was unobstructed. On the mantel, I placed the only thing I had kept from my previous life, a small, tarnished lapel pin of the Secret Service star. It wasn't there as a badge of office, but as a reminder of what happens when we forget that the most important service we can offer is to one another. I am an old man now. My hair is the color of the winter frost, and my joints ache when the rain rolls in over the ridges. But every morning, I walk out onto my porch, and I watch the sun rise over a world that is quiet and green and very much alive. The dead still walk in the dark places of the world, I know, and humanity is still a fragile, flickering flame. But as I look down into the valley and see the smoke from a dozen chimneys and hear the sound of the next generation waking up to a day without fear, I know that the oath I took so many years ago has finally been honored. I didn't save the president. I didn't save the White House. I didn't save the country. I saved something better. I saved the hope that we can start again. I grip the railing of the porch, my breath blooming in the cold morning air, and I watch the light break over the world, washing it clean, just like I knew it would. The badge didn't matter. The axe didn't matter. Only this moment and the peace that comes with knowing that the long night is finally, truly over.